Neil Armstrong was the first man to set foot on the moon. Neil was born on August 5, 1930 in Wapakoneta, Ohio. His parents were Stephen Armstrong and Viola Armstrong. Neil grew up with a love for planes and flying. He enjoyed planes so much he began his career with NASA in Ohio.
Neil Armstrong served as a naval aviator from 1949 to 1952. He then joined the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, in 1555. For the next 17 years, he served as a naval aviator, engineer, test pilot, astronaut, and administrator for NACA and NASA. Neil Armstrong was command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission. He was also spacecraft commander for the Apollo 11. Being commander of all these missions showed that Neil was a great leader.
There are many remarks that the moon landing was all a scam. There really is no way to prove it except for the millions of people who actually saw the huge spacecraft take off.
Neil Armstrong was a loving, caring, and overall a great man that showed leadership and definitely created a legacy. Neil died on August 25, 2012, when he was only 82. We all remember this great person and his great mission, the first man on the moon. Neil Armstrong showed great leadership. He led his team during the Gemini 8 mission and was space commander for Apollo 11. Neil was a noble and very kind person. He was rewarded for being such a great person by being placed as head of every mission. Neil Armstrong is considered a leader the most, mainly because he was the first man to walk on the moon. He was the first on the moon, and he gained leaders. Most people consider that a sign of a good leader. Neil Armstrong is usually recognized for the first moon landing, but he not only was a leader during this mission. Neil showed leadership by being responsible, and brave. He also was not selfish. By selfish, I mean that he gave recognition to everyone who made the moon landing possible. Neil Armstrong was a great leader. Neil is a great example of a leader, and his acts are some examples of showing leadership. A leader usually creates a legacy, and Neil Armstrong definitely did that. Neil found it very hard not to take all the credit for being the first man on the moon. He was not the only person that made this mission possible. Neil Armstrong led the world and his team to the moon. He made sure that his family knew he'd be safe. Neil Armstrong changed history as we know it. And now we have had a great leader in our lives.
Neil Armstrong left an amazing legacy. He was the first man to step on the moon. Yes, we all know there were others with him that also stepped on the moon, but Neil was the first to venture out and touch the moon's surface. When that amazing act happened, the nation was amazed. When the United States had been able to send living men to space, Neil's first step was something grand. It had shown how far we had come in space travel. The moment his foot touched the ground, we were already celebrating. It was a huge feat to send men to the moon and back. Neil was one of the most recognized astronauts from the Apollo 11. As I repeat, it's the fact that he was the first to set his foot down on the ground. That's what makes him so famous. But also, he left a legacy for having the courage to even think about leaving the Earth and going to space, going to the moon, space, a huge vastness of uncountable wonders, and the moon, a place where man had not yet claimed for itself. When he set the flag down, the world was elated. We had finally uncovered many of the mysteries of the moon, even though there are many left to this day. Neil and his crew were able to bring back moon rocks. Actual pieces of the moon to study were brought to Earth. Neil Armstrong's legacy is so great, Even now, decades later, we talk about him and his group and how they fearlessly took off in the spacecraft to land on the moon and claim for man. Legacies are not just made by anyone. They take a person who has great courage and strength to do what is thought to be the impossible. Neil Armstrong and his crew broke through those impossible walls and took those impossible steps on the moon, Neil being the first to step on the once thought unreachable moon. The legacy that Neil left has inspired many people to follow their dreams of what we call impossible. Neil will always be remembered as the first man on the moon. To many, he is also the man who broke down walls, made the impossible possible, and opened our eyes to a whole new world, space, and the moon. A place where we were able to create a legacy to last for ages to come. Neil will never be forgotten for that famous day. He will always be thought of whenever we talk about the moon, the place where man was able to send life to space and back. This was the place where Neil created a legacy for himself that would last way beyond his lifetime.
Neil Armstrong died on September 14th, 2010. Neil was buried at sea in the Atlantic Ocean. We will all remember this great hero in our lives. We will also remember how he was such a great leader and the legacy he created.